Oppy, Mackie, Sobel, and Schmid. These are the kind of philosophers that you will find most often cited by more philosophically informed atheists. So I wanted to see how they do against the argument for motion, or the first way of St. Thomas Aquinas. Let's start by looking at Graham Oppy's book, Arguing About Gods. For starters, the argument is plainly invalid. The most that could follow from the premise is that there are first causes of change that are not in the process of change. There's nothing in the premise of this argument that justifies drawing the conclusion that there is a unique first cause of change that is not itself in the process of change. So I would argue that Oppy here is misunderstanding St. Thomas's conclusion, or is relying on others who are misunderstanding it. I would argue that St. Thomas does not intend the first way to conclude that there is a unique first cause. This is why in question 11, article 3 of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas Aquinas questions whether God is one, and concludes that it is impossible, therefore, that many gods should exist. If St. Thomas were to take the first way to establish that there is a single unique first cause, then he would, as he often does in the Summa, state that it has already been proven previously that there is a single unique first cause. But he doesn't do that, which indicates to me that he doesn't believe that. So the charge of invalidity is false in my opinion. He continues saying the second premise, that anything is in a process of change, is being changed by something else, seems highly controversial. There are objectively chancy processes, then there are processes of change that are not brought about by anything else. This is simply not true. All that St. Thomas's claim ultimately amounts to is that any reduction of potentiality to actuality is reduced by something actual. A potentiality could be reduced to actuality by something in actuality without being determined to being actualized in X or Y way. So, for example, let's say a person can will either to eat steak or to eat a salad. Suppose that person wills freely to eat a steak. It isn't necessary that the potentiality is not reduced to actuality by God. What's necessary is simply that God doesn't determine which actuality is actualized. Just because a cause actualizes a potential doesn't mean that it determines the fact that that potential is actualized rather than another. That's like an additional claim that isn't necessary. I should also note that Aristotle presents an argument for this premise in the Physics, Book 7. The argument is based on a earlier conclusion he proved that everything in motion is divisible. He basically notes that divisibles would not move if its parts were not moving. Hence, since everything in motion is divisible, everything in motion depends on its parts for its motion. Even if we suppose that a particle just pops into existence randomly and is moving without a prior cause, this will still be dependent on that particle's parts. And it would still be true that everything in motion is moved by another. There is not even a need to deny that a particle can pop into existence and move without a prior cause. All that's necessary is to note that this is made of parts, and therefore it depends on another. So I think Oppy's criticism here doesn't work. Oppy also addresses the infinite regress, but his most significant criticism of St. Thomas's argument is dealt with in his criticism of the second way. Aquinas does offer an argument on behalf of the key infinite regress premise in the second way, recapitulating a similar argument that is given in the first way. What he says is that if there were no first cause in a series of causes, then there would be no intermediate causes either, and hence no effect. But this argument is powerless to establish the conclusion that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. For if there were an infinite regress of causes, then it would be true that there is no first cause, and yet it could also be true that if any of the earlier causes were eliminated, the effect would be eliminated as well. I think Oppy here simply doesn't understand the argument. Let's see how St. Thomas describes the argument. This process cannot be traced back into infinity, for everything that is moved by another is a sort of instrument of the first mover. Therefore, if a first is lacking, all things that move will be instruments. But if the series of movers and things moves is infinite, there can be no first mover. In such a case, these infinitely many movers and things moved will all be instruments. But even the unlearned perceive how ridiculous it is to suppose that instruments are moved, unless they are set in motion by some principal agent. This would be like fancying that when a chest or a bed is being built, the saw or hatchet performs its function without a carpenter. So the reason St. Thomas sees the infinite regress as impossible is because he's thinking about a series where each member moves as an instrument. And hence, of course, instruments cannot move without the first principle, which causes an instrument to move, just by definition. But why think that motion involves a sort of series? The reason is because it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. As St. Thomas explains in the Summa Theologiae, whatever is in motion cannot have its actuality it is moved towards in itself, but it must receive it from another. Hence, if you have an infinite regress of things in motion, or things without their actuality in themselves, this would lead to an impossible situation where you have these instrumental causes without a first. Or, in other words, actually driving this actuality from another when nothing has that actuality. This makes no sense. So, for those who are interested, I do have a video called, I think, Why an Infinite Regress is Impossible. And I explained in a little more detail the logic here. In any case, I think it is clear that an infinite regress of the kind presented in the argument for motion is impossible, and Oppy just didn't understand the argument. J.L. Mackie rejects the first way as depending too much on antiquated physical theory to be of much interest now. Now, this may have been the view decades ago when he wrote this, but since several philosophers, for example Edward Feser, have defended the first way as not depending on Aristotelian physics but on his metaphysics, a refutation of this argument would require more than a flippant comment like that today. That said, Mackie does address the idea of an infinite regress being impossible, and he seems to understand the point. He says that if a creature's essence doesn't include existence, then driving existence from an infinite regress will do no good. Nothing could end it but a being whose essence involves existence. But he asks, why, for example, might there not be a permanent stock of matter whose essence did not involve existence, but which did not derive its existence from anything else? This is the brute facts approach to the proofs for existence of God. Maybe things just exist without any cause, but I'd argue this is nonsense. As Garrigou Lagrange said, we are absolutely certain that every being which is indifferent to existence requires an efficient cause. That is to say, has to be realized, whether in time or from eternity, makes no difference. Because the intellect knows intuitively that this being does not exist as something which has existence intrinsically and primarily as its own, per se prima, but as something which gets this existence from another. If a thing's essence does not include existence, then considered in itself it is indifferent to existence. It may or may not exist. So, when considering aliens, for example, because their essence and existence are distinct, you can understand their essence without understanding their existence. Hence, you need something else in addition to its essence to determine one way or another whether it exists, to distinguish it from nothing. Without this distinguishing factor, there would be no difference between something that exists and something that does not exist, which would violate the principle that being is not non-being, or the principle of non-contradiction. As Scott Sullivan said, to ask why a thing exists is the same as the question what distinguishes this thing from nothing. To lack a distinction from nothing is to be identical to nothing, and thus not a being at all. Therefore, there must be something that makes beings distinct from nothing, a reason or fundamentum distinctionis. And that reason cannot be nothing, for then there would be no distinction. To hold two things as distinct with absolutely no difference between them is a nonsensical position. In short, if nothing distinguishes a being from nothing, then it is not distinguished from nothing. Unless you're willing to deny basic principles of being, I don't think denying the existence of a cause, of the existence of a being, intrinsically indeterminate with respect to existence, is logical or reasonable. If they are intrinsically determinate with respect to existence, then they need to be extrinsically determined to exist. So now let's turn to Sobel, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, so I apologize if I'm not. But let's turn to his book, Logic and Theism. The first way is vulnerable to the apparent possibility of self-moving things that have always been in motion. For St. Thomas Aquinas' premise that whatever is moved by another is presumably meant to be a statement of strict metaphysical necessity. But it seems that at least things in perpetual motion could be self-movers. It seems, in Aquinas' Aristotelian terms, that they could be at every moment things is actually in motion and potentially in motion in the immediate future. Their changing potentialities could be continuously actualized by the action of their immediately antecedent actualities. This conception of a self-moving perpetual mover does not involve its being in the same respect and same way, both mover and moved. The issue is that what St. Thomas's argument shows is that beings which can change are in themselves indifferent to the actuality. In order for the water to be changed from hot to cold, say, the water has to be considered in itself indifferent to hot or cold. Hence, it cannot be in virtue of the water itself that it is hot or cold. Otherwise, it would necessarily be hot or cold. You need some additional feature to determine it to heat or cold. As St. Thomas Aquinas said, everything which is able to be and not be has a cause. For considered in itself, it is indifferent to either, so that something else must exist which determines it to one. Sobel also says that the first way has analogical problems to the second way. So we will look at those problems. 1. There is no good reason for thinking that infinite regresses of efficient generation causes are impossible. The issue here, and you have to read the context to understand this, but Sobel interprets St. Thomas Aquinas' idea of the series of causality as being of the per accidens kind. He equates generating cause with meaning not a per se cause. I don't think this is the correct way of viewing St. Thomas's arguments. As I pointed out above, the actuality that a thing is changing towards is not present in the thing moving, so it must be in another. This sort of causal relation is one of necessary dependence, because the actuality is had by deriving it here and now from another. Furthermore, I don't see generating causes as being necessarily per accidens. God could generate a creature and still be a cause simultaneous with the effect, but more importantly, a necessary cause for the continued existence of the effect. There's nothing incoherent about this model, and it is necessary that these sort of causes exist, supposing the logic I gave above, derived from St. Thomas, is correct. In any case, we already explained why an infinite regress per se is impossible, and you can view my video on the topic for a further explanation. 2. Even if one could demonstrate that there has been, for things that have generating causes, unique first generating causes, there is no obvious reason why each should have had the same first generating cause as every other. So the first way, and the second way for that matter, do not claim there is only one unique first generating cause, as I said earlier. This is why in question 11, article 3 of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas Aquinas answers the question of whether God is one or many. If St. Thomas thought that the first way proved this, he would have just cited that. But he didn't do that. Rather, St. Thomas provided 3 unique reasons why God is one. 3. Even if that were well established, there are no obvious reasons why this unique first generating cause of sensible things should still exist. Okay, St. Thomas Aquinas gives reasons for why God is eternal in question 10, article 2 of the first part of the Summa Theologiae. So, a lot of people seem to do this thing where they just read the, second question of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, see that it says, oh, well, this is God, and then assume that St. Thomas has the same conception of God as they do. By God, I think all that St. Thomas Aquinas is getting at is something which has everything that it is within itself, has existence in an underderived way, and everything else derives existence from it. And that's all that he means by God. He's not claiming God is unique or eternal or anything like that. That's why he has these preceding articles and later questions proving that. Okay, so Joe Schmid and I have gone back and forth on this several times, so I wasn't planning on going back to this again, but I keep getting requests to respond again, and Joe himself sent me some new stuff from him, so I'm going to comment on this. First, I actually agree with his overall point, which I think is that the first way doesn't prove that the first cause is one. As I said above, this is why we have St. Thomas questioning whether God is one in later questions. St. Thomas Aquinas answers the question of whether God is one or many. So I think Joe is correct to criticize scholars who have interpreted the first way as proving that. Now, there is a part where I do disagree with his article, and that's where he addresses St. Thomas's proof for God's pure actuality. Here's what he says. It doesn't follow that there would be an entire concrete object, i.e. being, that is prior to the first being. Instead, the actuality or actualities of a single being, B, could be prior to the potentiality or potencies of B. Hence, act would be prior to potency, but there would be nothing prior to B. Hence, in principle, B could be a first being, while nevertheless having potency. I think this is actually a misunderstanding of what St. Thomas Aquinas is claiming. I don't think St. Thomas is claiming here that necessarily the pure actuality, which is prior to all potentialities, is necessarily not a part of a whole being, because he asks in Article 8 this question, whether God enters into the composition of other things, and provides an argument against that possibility. Furthermore, if you go back to Aristotle's original argument for motion, what he argues there is that we know that everything is moved by another, because even if we have a whole that moves itself, this whole is going to be composed of parts based on early arguments inside of the physics, and this whole is going to depend on those parts for its existence, and so therefore the whole depends on another. And that's literally his conclusion. And of course, St. Thomas agrees with that conclusion. And so what they're treating the parts as they're treating them as another. And so I don't think when St. Thomas is saying that, there's this other, and this other is what all things depend on for its existence, and it causes the motion of things, that therefore this is not a part of the whole. That's if you pay attention to how the arguments are laid out in both Aristotle's Physics and the Summa Theologiae, that doesn't seem to be what he's trying to get at. Regardless, though, you can use Article 8 to prove that the first being is not a part of a whole. So this isn't really a problem in the grand scheme of things, even if you hold that St. Thomas made a mistake here. Second, as we've seen, the first way only gets us to the claim that there is at least one first member, T, of chain C, that is actually unmoved at time t in respect to the causal power or property of C. Assuming, of course, the truth of the first way's causal principle and the requirement that per se chains be finite, it therefore does not establish the existence of a first being, that is, the most fundamental being, more fundamental than all else and in every respect. Instead, it only shows at most that each chain has a first member T of that chain, which has nothing prior to it in respect to the causal power of C, only during times at which T stands as first member of C. But this is perfectly compatible with T standing in potency in some other respects, e.g. in some respect that has nothing to do with causal power property of the C, for which it serves as terminus. Hence, it is perfectly compatible with there being something more fundamental than T in that particular respect, but yet not with respect to the causal power / property of C. Okay, let's try to formulate St. Thomas Aquinas' argument before responding. 1. Actuality is prior to potentiality. 2. Nothing is prior to God. 3. If God were at all potential, actuality would have to be prior to God, at least partially. Therefore, God cannot be at all potential. Now, it is important to ensure we do not confuse premise 1 with a premise more directly derived from the causal principle in the first way, which is something like actuality is prior to a potential which has been actualized. Given this premise, we need something actual prior to a potential which has been actualized, but we don't necessarily need actuality prior to potentiality which is unactualized. Hence, you can have a being or beings which are composed of potentiality and actuality without anything being prior to them. St. Thomas's claim is much broader. It isn't only that those things which are actualized have to be actualized by another. He says actuality is prior to potentiality without qualification. Thus, by this principle, even unactualized potentials would have to be preceded ontologically by actuality proportionate to the potential. But why would anyone believe this broader premise? He gives a reason. For whatever is in potentiality can be reduced into actuality only by some being in actuality. It might not be immediately clear how St. Thomas's premise follows from this causal premise, but the way I interpret this is that potentiality could not exist if there were no actuality to actualize it. Hence, the existence of potentiality depends on actuality. Hence, there is a sort of sustaining relation between unactualized potentials and actuality. The moment the actuality proportionate to the unactualized potentiality goes out of existence, so does the unactualized potentiality. Hence, actuality is prior to potentiality, absolutely. Joe challenges premise 2 of this argument, saying there is a first unmoved, but that doesn't mean it is unmovable. Thus, there could be something ontologically prior to the first unmoved of a given causal chain. I think we have to consider that the essential conclusion of the first way isn't that there is a being which is currently not moving. If that were the conclusion, then, that unmoving being could just be a fully actualized being which had just finished its movement. I don't think that's what St. Thomas was trying to get at. As I explained earlier, the key here is the fact that the actuality is derived from another, since it is indifferent to that actuality in itself. That's why St. Thomas explains motion in terms of actuality and potentiality in the first place. All that St. Thomas's first way is essentially saying is, hey, these things do not have what they have in a self-contained way. They derive it from another, We know this because they have the ability to change. And things that have the ability to change are in potentiality with respect to that actuality. They don't have that actuality in themselves. So when we look at Joe's claim that all the first way gets you to is an unmoved being that could have been moved either in some other way or at another time, what you should ask yourself is this: does this unmoved being have all of its actuality in itself, or is it derived from another? If the being is movable, then the answer is going to be no, even if the being is not moving now. If the movable being isn't moving now, then the actuality that grounds that potentiality, which is currently unmoved, doesn't exist in the being itself. It is derived from another. Even though the potentiality is not currently being actualized, the being still participates in the actuality of something external to it, because that actuality is the source of the potential. So the way I interpret the first way, Joe's objection isn't an issue. Now maybe I interpret it a little more liberally than Joe does, and that's fine. If Joe wants to criticize a particular interpretation of the first way, that's fine. But I think I'm getting closer to what St. Thomas was actually trying to communicate. And in any case, it certainly seems true that there ultimately has to be a being which is purely act, given this way of looking at the argument. So I think the key takeaway is, once we establish the reasoning behind St. Thomas's causal principle and his opposition to an infinite regress per se, even the objections by the most sophisticated atheist fail. So if you want to defend this argument, what I would recommend you do, watch my video demonstrating the principle of causality. Watch my video explaining why there can be no infinite regress. And then also watch my video on the metaphysics of the first way. Those three together will allow you to respond to it, even criticisms by experts in the philosophy of religion. Anyway, thanks for watching.